Hello, everyone, and welcome to ICC for the recap of the final match of the FIDE Grand Prix Leg 1 in Berlin between Hikaru Nakamura and Aronian. My name is John Burke, and I am very excited to look at these games with you. We've already seen some really exciting chess being played in both the group stage and also the semifinals, and while I won't spoil anything for you, I will say that this match was not boring whatsoever. It uses the same format as the semifinals. The players play two classical games. If those are tied, then they move into two rapid games. If they're still tied, then they move into two blitz, and finally they would, if necessary, break the tie with Armageddon. And it's safe to say that both Hikaru and Levon have been playing really excellently this whole event so far. They've been in fantastic form, and I really don't want to delay any longer because we have some exciting stuff to get to, so I'm just going to jump right into game one here. So in the first game, Hikaru had the white pieces, and when you have the white pieces in a two-game match, you really want to try to strike first, so let's see what happened. Hikaru opens with e4, and they go pretty quickly into a Roy Lopez, and there's no surprises here in this opening. Levon is trying to go for the Marshall attack. That's been his main opening as black against e4 for basically the entirety of his elite career. And as so often these days, Hikaru doesn't play c3 allowing d5. Instead he plays an anti-Marshall. And Levon plays bishop b7, d3, and he could still play d5 here if he wants. It's a gambit line that's very reasonable for black, but in this game he decides to play d6, more solid. a3 is played. The idea is just to give the bishop on a2 a square to go to in case of knight a5. Queen d7, knight c3, and knight d8. This is a pretty typical idea in this sort of position. The knight on c6 isn't really that well placed. A lot of the times in the Roy Lopez, you see this knight maneuvering either maybe to b8 to d7 in the Breyer defense, for example, or to a5 in the Chigorin, and this is another route that it could take. It goes to e6, exerting some influence in the center, and black can also play c5 if he wants to clamp down on d4. Hikaru plays knight h2 to play knight g4. This strikes me as a little slow. If he wanted to try to punish knight d8, if he wanted to claim that this is too slow a move, then he could have played d4 here, trying to immediately undertake something in the center, and I think white would be slightly better here. Instead he plays knight h2, quite clearly aiming for knight g4, but Levon doesn't really care. He just plays knight e6, continuing his plan. Knight g4, king h8. It's a useful move, getting the king off this a2 to g8 diagonal, which the bishop is currently aiming at. Knight takes f6, takes, queen g4, and now Levon plays a very nice move. He plays rook a to e8, and this illustrates a pretty high-level understanding of the position, because you might think that the rooks belong on e8 and d8 here, and that black could have played rook fe8 instead, but that would be missing the point of the position. The idea is the rook on f8 is very well placed because Levon has an idea of playing g6, moving the bishop away from f6, and then playing f5. And that would create a pretty strong kingside attack. So Hikaru knows that he can't just sit around. If he played some lazy moves like bishop to e3 or something along those lines, then Levon would be able to get in his plan I just mentioned of maneuvering and organizing for f5, and black would be doing very well. So instead he plays a4 to try to create something on the other side of the board. b4, knight e2. He could have also gone forward with knight d5, that might be more natural. And here queen d8 is a little bit surprising. I would have expected Levon to just continue with the plan I mentioned, either with bishop d8 or maybe g6 first is most accurate, and aiming for f5. c3. Again, Hikaru knows that he should create some play of his own, so he's trying to undermine these queenside pawns. B takes, g6, bishop to d5, asking the question to this bishop on b7, what it wants to do. You don't really want to play c6 and block it in, so Levon decides to trade. And this knight does find a nice home on c5. It's not easy to kick it out. And bishop h6, this kind of instigates a forcing sequence that is pretty instructive, because instead of routinely moving the rook or playing bishop g7 to defend it, both of those moves are fine, but he decides to play knight takes d3 immediately. And that might look like a mistake, because Hikaru could have played rook e to d1 here, and it looks like the knight's attacked, the rook on f8 is attacked, but there's a bit of a problem here. After the move e4, bishop takes f8, black would not recapture on f8 because of queen takes e4, but he can throw in this intermediate move with h5, and suddenly this queen is going to get really sidelined, as you'll see. It has to go to g3, there's no other square. Now bishop h4, another intermediate move. You can't go queen e3 because if bishop takes f2, so you have to put your queen on this really, really bad square. And black would take on f2 with check and then take on f8. And you would see here that black has 2 pawns for the exchange and more than enough. It's just completely winning for black because his knight on d3 is a monster, white's queen on h2 is really, really bad, and white's king is weak too. He's going to have to deal with knight f2 check coming in a few moves, so this is awful. So white can't do this at all. And Hikaru saw that, so instead of playing rook e to d1, he took the rook immediately, knight takes e1, and it's interesting here, instead of playing bishop h6, knight d3, and continuing from that position, he just decides to take the knight, bring the queen to c4, and try to play against black's pawns on the queen side. You see that white is still down a pawn here, but Hikaru is arguing that after queen a8, rook b1, it's not easy for black to really make use of his extra pawn because of his pawn weaknesses on the queen side, on a6 and c7. And also importantly, white has control of the b file here. That's really critical. If black was able to get to the b file first, then it would just be very, very good for black. But now, even though black is up a pawn, it's not really clear where his plan is going to come from. So rook b8, rook b4. Of course, you don't really want to trade and give black an active queen that would come into b1 or b2 next move. King g7, knight g3, improving the knight. h5, you can sort of see that black is just making generally useful moves, but Levon hasn't hit on a clear plan at the moment. He's just trying to gradually improve his position step by step. Hikaru plays knight to e4, bishop to d8, and a5. And now we see that he's fixing this weakness on a6. And even though Hikaru is down a pawn, I would argue he has the most important pawn on the board right now, which is the a5 pawn. Because if you imagine this a5 pawn ever becomes a passed pawn, it's going to be very close to queening. So Levon has to take care about that. And there's a neat trap that I want to show. If Levon had played this natural move f5, he would be basically lost, actually, because of this move knight to g5, threatening to put this knight on this absolutely dominant outpost on e6, and black can't take on g5 because of queen takes c7 check. So that's why Levon played queen to a7 here. The idea is to defend this c7 pawn, and now f5 is possible. g3 by Hikaru, f5, now the knight has to go backwards, knight d2. And finally, Levon decides to trade on b4, but this is a little bit of a risky decision, because after c takes b4, white has a very straightforward way of creating a passed pawn now. He can just play b5. So this a pawn for white is going to become a really big factor. e4, knight b3, wants to go knight d4. Obviously Levon can't allow that, so he cuts that knight off. King g2 and h4. It's a very interesting situation where even though black is up a pawn, it feels like white is turning the tide of the game here. He's dictating the course of the game. He's ready to play b5. So that's why Levon decides to play h4 and get some play going of his own. G takes. King f7. And here Hikaru could have played a very tricky move. He played h5 in the game. I wonder what would have happened after queen c6. This sets a really nice trap. It looks like Hikaru's idea is to play queen d7, so you can just play king e7 to stop it. But this would be a mistake, because most accurate for white here would be to throw in this move h5 to weaken black's pawns, and after g takes, this beautiful move knight c5, and there's just no good way to stop queen d7 here. And if you take dc5, then white plays queen e6, queen takes f6, and just takes all of black's pawns with check. And yeah, that would be completely winning for white. So after queen c6, it would still be okay for Levon. He would have to go king g7 back, but it's very scary for black there. But Hikaru chose h5 instead. G takes, and now b5. So we see that he's going forward with this passed pawn. e3, Levon knows he has to create counterplay against white's king. f4, and now this really critical move. This is move 39. On move 40 they get extra time, so Levon found a really good move towards the end of the time control. Queen b8. Good double attack against this b5 pawn, and also to play queen g8 and start creating play of his own with his queen. So Hikaru avoids queen g8 by playing king f1. A takes b5, queen c6. And now here we can see that this a pawn is unstoppable. White is going to play a6, queen b7 if necessary, and then that pawn is going to become a queen. There's absolutely nothing nothing black can do about that. And the only recourse that black has here is not to try to stop the pawn, that's a lost cause, but he has to create play of his own against white's king. So that's why we see this by Levon, e2. This e3 pawn is more of a hindrance than anything. It prevents the black queen from getting in along the a7 to g1 diagonal. So Levon just gets rid of it, and he plays queen a7. He wants to play queen g1 and try to organize some play against white's king. So we see a6, queen g1, queen c7, king g6. Knight d2, Hikaru brings the knight back to try to guard against the oncoming checks from black's queen. Queen h2, king d1, queen takes f4, a7. This is very scary for black. He's one move away from losing, of course. If white could queen, that would be it. But Levon has already seen what he's planning next. He threatens mate in 1. Hikaru sees it. b4, again, renewing the threat. Queen drops back. b3, this continuing forward. And now if knight takes b3, black has a perpetual check in many ways. He could play queen f1, king c2, queen c4, etc. There's no way for white to avoid the checks. So instead, he plays queen a5, but Levon finds one more nice move, queen e3, setting up another mechanism, threatening queen g1. Hikaru sees nothing better than making another queen, and now queen g1, king e2, queen e3, and here the player is just repeated king d1, queen g1, because if white plays king f1, then queen takes h3, and it's still a perpetual. So very, very well played game by both sides. I think a draw is a deserved result. So that meant that Levon had the white pieces in the next game with the chance to win the match if he could score a win. So again, we have e4, e5. This time we have an Italian by Levon. d3, knight f6. They're playing standard moves here. Bishop a7. And now here I've highlighted this path, knight to d2 to f1 to g3, which is normally in these Italian positions the plan that white chooses, but here Levon plays a different idea. He plays knight a3 to c2, knight e7, knight c2, bishop to e3. So white is aiming just for some slight pressure here. Nothing too special, but it can be unpleasant for black in the long run. Bishop b3, h6. We see the bishop comes around to c2, and that can support the e4 pawn if white pushes d4 later. So these Italian games are generally protracted maneuvering struggles. Rook e8, they're just both playing useful moves. Queen c7, and d4. So Levon is the first to strike in the center here, and Hikaru takes immediately, which is an interesting choice. He doesn't maintain the pawn tension. This forces white to take with the queen because the e4 pawn is under attack. And now c5, which it weakens the d5 square, but that's not so relevant here because it's very well guarded. Black can put a bishop on e6 whenever he wants to defend it. Queen d2, and now bishop to g4. So this is, again, a very direct way of playing for black. He's allowing his bishop to be traded off here, but he's evaluated that it's not so big a deal here. It's not that easy for white to take advantage of these light square weaknesses. Sure, he has a light squared bishop, but if he plays bishop b3, then black can always consider c4 if he wants to. And this move by Levon, but it's queen d1 move, looks a little bit strange, but the idea is he wants to try to keep some pieces on the board. If Hikaru plays knight to e5, then he's prepared the square on d2. He vacated it for his knight. And next he can play g3 and f4 to kick the knight away and enjoy a pretty pleasant position. His knight on d2 can relocate to c4 if necessary. So Hikaru doesn't play this. He plays b5 instead, opening up the b file and creating play against the b2 pawn. Of course, he has his own weakness on a6, so they kind of have this dynamic balance on the queen side. And now Levon plays knight d2, and I think this move is based on an oversight. It leads to a forced draw, more or less, but I don't think Levon wanted to go for a draw. He could have played a move like rook b2 or rook b1 or rook a2 here, and defended this pawn, and still could have tried to create some slight pressure. I mean, this d6 pawn and a6 pawn for black, they're still weak, so white is certainly slightly better. It's not a big deal, but he could have pressed on. But after knight d2, queen takes b2, we have this forcing sequence that arises, and there aren't too many alternatives along the way for either side. So obviously if we take the knight on g4, the c2 bishop is hanging. Levon played knight c4. I think he originally wanted to play rook b1, but then noticed that after queen takes c3, rook b3, there's this move queen to d4, and this would be good for black because he's still keeping contact with the d2 knight, and he's also attacking the f2 pawn. So white can't do this at all. Instead, he played knight c4, queen takes c3, and knight to b6. It's this kind of tempo game they have going on. They're both gaining tempos against the opponent's pieces. Rook to b8, knight comes around to d5 to attack the queen. And again, the queen has to stay in contact with the c2 bishop. It can't go away to, say, e5, because the g4 knight would fall. And if you play queen c4 here, then rook a4 is a problem. And white would win a piece here, and the game. So queen b2 is the only move. And keep in mind that white is down a couple of pawns here, so he's got to do something forcing. And there's nothing better than a repetition here. He plays rook b1 to harass the queen. It has to stay attacking the bishop on c2, so queen a2, rook a1 back, queen b2, and that's how the game ended, in a draw. So white had a few chances there. He could have, back at this moment, kept the game going by not playing knight d2, but in any case, it's pretty close to equal. So that meant that the score was 2-2, and they move on to a rapid tiebreak, 15 plus 10 time control, I believe. and Hikaru got white in the first game. So let's take a look at this one. So we have another Roy Lopez. Going through the opening quick because it's the same as game 1. Except in this case, Levon, instead of playing the solid d6, plays this more forcing line with d5. In the spirit of the marshal, Hikaru takes on d5. And white can take on e5 here. It's an interesting position. I think black is okay, but there's a lot of interesting opportunities for both sides. But instead he plays a4. Knight d4. Again, Levon goes very direct into the center. Knight b to d2. And it might look a bit surprising to just give up this light squared bishop for apparently so cheaply, but white has his own trumps here. First of all, this pawn on e5 is under attack, so that's an immediate threat. And also, this knight on b3 can come to a5, and the c5 square might become a weakness in the long term. For now, black has a bishop on e7, of course, but if it ever gets traded, then these dark squares could become a problem. So black can play f6 here to defend the pawn. That's a perfectly good move, but Levon plays something very interesting with knight to b4. And it's just basically a pawn sacrifice. Knight takes e5, queen to d5. And the point is that there's only two reasonable ways to guard against mate on g2, f3 or knight to f3. And if knight to f3, then black has this move queen to d7, and it might be a bit surprising, but white doesn't have a comfortable move here. Black is threatening to take on f3, and white doesn't want to recapture with the pawn and wreck his king side. But if he takes with the queen, then knight takes c2 as a fork. And there's really not a whole lot of optimal ways to defend against this. So that's why Hikaru plays f3 instead. But this has its own downsides. It's weakening some of the dark squares around the king, and also the g1 to a7 diagonal. So Levon plays bishop to d6, d4, rook a to e8, a b5, a takes b5, bishop to d2. And now comes a little bit of the danger of playing this opening for black in a rapid game, because in classical you can take your time, you can think here and figure out the best way to proceed. But in rapid, you don't really have that luxury. And black is down a pawn, and he has to be the one to prove the compensation. And if he's not accurate, then white will be a pawn up. And that's pretty much what happened in the game. Apparently, the only way for black to maintain compensation is this surprising move, bishop to c8. The idea is this bishop on b7 has done its job, it's induced f3, but it doesn't really serve that much of a purpose anymore. So now you have to bring it back around to f5 or e6, and black is fine here. Instead, after knight c6, bishop to f4, the problem here is this bishop on f4 and the bishop on d6 are going to be traded soon, and if black loses the bishop pair, then his activity is basically gone. That's his main asset in this position. He plays king h8. The idea is to meet knight c6 with bishop to f4, because there's no knight e7 check anymore. But Hikaru just plays bishop to h2. He's defending the bishop, and he's preparing to take on c6, and he's still a pawn up, and he's going to trade off this dark squared bishop. So Levon takes everything on e5, and he regains material equality, but if you remember what I said before about these dark squared weaknesses on a5 and c5, this is kind of the dream scenario for white. This is exactly what he wanted. And in particular, if he can trade queens and reach an endgame, his knight will be much better than the opponent's bishop because of these dark squared weaknesses. And Hikaru achieves just that. Queen c5 forces a queen trade because the f8 rook is attacked. And we get into this position where the rook can invade also on a7. And with c6, black has this sort of stable construction with this bishop on d5 and these two pawns, but it's only temporary, because white can bring his knight around to b4 whenever he wants to, attacking both the bishop and the pawn. And this is exactly what we see. And black is in trouble here. He has to worry about defending the c6 pawn, and there's no good way to do it. He decided to just give it away in the game. Perhaps he should play rook a1 and perhaps rook c1 after that to try to gain some activity and go behind white's pawns. Instead he plays king g7, and after knight takes c6, he's down a pawn in a rook endgame, and of course the phrase goes, the famous adage, all rook endgames are drawn. That's not exactly true, especially if you're just a clean pawn up, and white should be winning with correct play, but it's rapid and it's never easy. This move g4 is a little bit surprising, exposing the second rank. Apparently the best way for white is b4, and I don't want to get too bogged down in details, but basically white is going to set up this formation with his rook on c5 and pawn on c3, and he's going to keep that there, and then he can gradually bring his king around to h2 to g3 to f4, as well as advancing his own pawns h4 g4 after that. And black will not be able to both maintain the b5 pawn and also deal with the stuff white is doing on the king side. But these are subtleties that you really need time to figure out, so I'm not going to blame the players for any mistakes they make in a rapid game. So g4, rook d2, getting on this second rank, h4, h5. And the more pawns that black trades, the better drawing chances he'll get. b4, rook d4, and he even manages to take this h4 pawn. And it might look like rook c5 that white can win this b5 pawn, and he can win the pawn, but the problem is black will play rook c4 immediately after. And yeah, that's just not going to be enough for white to win. So he plays king g2 instead, and then Levin shifts his rook back to f5. It's very well placed there. f4, and probably there's a number of things that black can do here. He decides to immediately force matters with h4, which is fine. And this rook on f3, white can't win the b5 pawn without giving up the c3 pawn. So the only way for white to do something here is to bring his king. So that's what he does. He brings his king to e4 and then to d4. And here Levin makes a critical mistake. He had to play rook h3, and he will end up losing this b5 pawn, but in the process he can check the king far away to b3, and once he does that, now he starts going with this f pawn. And he has enough counterplay here to make a draw. And one example line is, if rook b8, I like the move king to e7 here, just making it hard for white to get behind the pawn. And black would be alright here. But of course it's hard to appreciate that when you're literally playing off the increment. So instead he decides to keep the white king cut off, but that's not really enough because white can always bring his rook around to the d file somehow, for example to d4, and then black cannot go into the pawn endgame, so white's king will be able to cross the line anyway. And for a while Hikaru's doing normal things, but then he starts doing something strange. He brings his rook to b8 in front of his pawns to advance. He could play king c5 and then run with his own pawns here, and there's a little bit to figure out there, but the general idea is that white can sacrifice his rook for the pawn once it is about to queen, and then the king and two connected passed pawns will be too far away for black to catch up to them in time. But he brings his rook to b8, and suddenly he's a few tempi behind because he's using his rook to support his b pawn instead of his king. And he decides to bring his king back, but now his own pawns are very much unguarded, and after rook b3 he has to spend another move with his king. King g4 is still fine for black. Now black is back in the drawing zone, but again, I'm not going to be too critical. And here rook a3 needed to be played, and white doesn't have a satisfactory way to advance his pawns together. Either he'll lose one of his pawns, or he'll waste enough time that black can make a queen and get back with his king in time. I've said this twice already, I think, but you can't really appreciate these subtleties with so little time. And f2 is a very obvious move, but the problem is, after this exchange here, this is a winning rook and pawn endgame for white. Black's king is cut off too far, it's cut off too many files away from the pawn, and he's also able to get his king to d3 and pawn to c4, and that's theoretically winning. And actually Levin flagged here as he was playing rook to c5, but it's winning anyway. I'll just show a line of what could have happened if he didn't flag. So he could have played rook c8 to try to start checking the white king, but the king would just advance, and the rook would get behind the pawn, and we see here that black's king is just too far away. White's going to play c5, c6, and there's nothing that black could do about it. So yeah, a very, very intense game, and Hikaru takes first blood in the rapid. So Levin gets the white pieces and a chance to strike back. This is a must-win game for him. And he goes back to the Italian. This time he plays rook e1 and c3 and d4. So he doesn't play d3, he plays d4 in one move. So it looks to me like he saved a tempo. That's a very interesting opening subtlety. And again, we have this sort of protracted maneuvering. I'm going to go quickly through it because it's not very exciting. Both sides are trying to implement their plans. There's this pawn tension on d4. It's very common in this structure. Black could have taken on d4 before if he wanted to, but instead he opts to keep the position closed. And Levin establishes this pawn center, this huge pawn mass of pawns on e4, d5, and c4. And then he breaks again with b4. He's trying to make something happen on the queen side. And this turns out to lead to some liquidation of pawns. And in this position, we have these mutual weaknesses, with black having a pawn on a6 and white having a pawn on b4. And white also has this idea of bringing a knight to c6, if possible. So I would say that I would prefer white, but black really shouldn't be in too much danger, because he can immediately attack the b4 pawn. Queen a3 and queen d8, preparing to bring the queen to b6. So you can note that white would like to play knight to b3 to a5 here, but knight to b3, queen to b6 would leave white without a satisfactory way to defend the b4 pawn. So instead he creates an idea of knight c4, but Hikaru just puts his bishop on b5. He's very stable, and they go into this endgame here. Levin decides to trade queens, and maybe you could say that visually white is better. He has more space, but the problem is you need more than this to win a game, and black will be able to play a5 to liquidate at some moment. And this is what Hikaru is trying to do. Knight e1, and I was very impressed with his next move, knight e8, because a5 is natural, and that would also be fine for black, but instead he wants to play f5 first to try to saddle white with a weakness on e4, and I'll show you what I mean. So Levin plays knight d3, f5, f3, guarding the pawn, and now this pawn on e4 cannot be protected by another pawn. So if in future positions, let's say white begins to invade in the future with his rook, he starts to attack the d6 pawn, then black can create his counterplay against the white e4 pawn as well, because it can no longer be protected by another pawn. So Hikaru created a weakness in Levin's camp by doing this. And again, he goes very direct. I think he defended this part of the game very impressively. He has this transformation of pawns here, and he can defend it with g5 whenever he wants to. So this is what happens. He just puts the pawn on g5, knight c4, and again, he doesn't do anything reckless. He just holds the position. He puts his knight on e8, he says everything's guarded, and he's claiming that he's fine here. And I think this is the moment where Levon had his last chance to try to make something happen. He could play king e2 just to bring the king to d3, because he really, really, really needs to maintain this knight on c4. He can meet rook c8 with king d3, and then maybe he can do something against the a6 pawn, or switch to the king side and try to undermine black's pawns there. But this would still leave white with some hopes. But after h4, it's just too slow. After rook c8, because this knight is going to be dislodged, you can't play like rook c3 here for white because of a5. That's the idea. So after knight a5, knight f6, we see that black is threatening to invade with rook c2, or play rook e8 to attack this e4 pawn. And Hikaru has one last really nice trick here. It looks like Levon is attacking the rook on b5 with tempo, and he's going to play knight e6 next, but Hikaru saw further. He has this really nice move, g4, and there's just no place to put the king. If you go to e2, there's rook takes e4 check. If king f2, knight takes e4 check. And after what he played, rook takes e4, king f5, he's actually very lucky that he's not losing a piece here, because he attacks the f6 knight. But this is not what he wants at all, because he's down a pawn in this endgame and he needs to win. So maybe white can hold this, he can draw the game with accurate play, but for Levon, a draw and a loss are basically the same thing. So yeah, this is basically over for him. And in fact, in a couple moves, he ends up getting mated. Rook f4 is a blunder because of rook h6, and Hikaru delivers a mate in a very funny way. He plays rook h8, and this was the last move of the game. It's really pretty. He's threatening to move his king g7, discovered mate, and white can't do anything against that. If king c8, then rook g7, and then the threat is renewed of king h7, which would be another way to mate. So yeah, overall, I don't really have too much to say, except Hikaru played amazingly, in the rapid portion especially. In the classical, Hikaru was struggling in the openings against Levon. He was maybe getting into a bit of trouble, but it was never an inordinate amount of trouble. It wasn't too much. He was able to hang in the game, find resources of his own, and he's such a tricky defender that he was never in too serious of a danger in the classical games. And by the time the rapid came around, he really showed his stuff. He showed why he's so strong and dangerous in quick time controls, and I think he was a very deserving winner. And Levon, it should be noted, played very well throughout this event. Even though he ended up losing in the finals, he still gets quite a few points for the Grand Prix standings, which will go quite a distance toward his candidate's hopes. And of course he would have preferred to win the match, but he's not going to be too dissatisfied with his performance either. And yeah, that's about it. I'm already looking forward to the next leg of the Grand Prix to see if the same players will continue to play well, or maybe some new faces will show up and make an impact on the standings. So until then, happy chess, and I hope you enjoyed the video.